Why won't God do something? That's the question a girl named Heather asked me after I had spoken at her campus ministry. She waited until all of the other students had finished, and then she walked up to where I had been standing. She poured out her family situation. She said, "Gary, I've prayed as sincerely as I know how, and as consistently as I know how. Why won't God do something? The situation isn't any better. In fact, it seems like the situation is getting worse. Have I done something wrong? Has my family done something wrong? Are we asking for the wrong requests? We feel like we're asking for what is good, and we're praying in faith, but nothing is changing. Why won't God do something?" Heather's not the first person to ask that question. And Heather won't be the last person to ask that question. We all have been in difficult situations in our lives, and we've needed relief, we've needed help, we've needed comfort, and we've prayed for those very requests. But we haven't gotten relief, and we haven't gotten comfort. We've asked, "God, why won't you do something? Have you just completely forgotten about us? Do you not care about the situation in which we are? God, why won't you do something?" The children of Israel asked the same question. And from God's response to them, I want us to get some help today. Would you open your Bibles, please, to Isaiah chapter 40. Let me give you a little bit of biblical and historical context. The children of Israel are the main human characters in the Old Testament. And their lives in the Old Testament really make up a roller coaster. Sometimes they were obedient to God and faithful to Him, and as a result of that, they enjoyed prosperity and success. And then there were times that they were disobedient to God, and as a result of that, the consequences of their own decisions came back on them, as well as the discipline of God. And they were in low situations. Well, by the time we get to Isaiah chapter 40, the children of Israel were coming out of a very difficult period. They had been disobedient to God, and God, not because He wanted to make their lives miserable, but because He cared about them and wanted them to turn from their evil ways, allowed the Babylonians to come in and take over Israel and carried many of them away into exile. The children of Israel realized that they had done wrong. They repented. They turned back to God. Their hearts were warming toward Him. But still they remained in exile. Still they remained in Babylon. And they said, "God, we know that we did wrong. But don't you see that we have turned back right? Don't you see that we are trying our very best to do what you want us to do? And still here we are. Have you forgotten about us? God, have you just turned away from us completely? Why won't you do something?" In reply to their requests, listen to what God said. Beginning in verse 27 of Isaiah chapter 40. God said, "Jacob, why do you say, and Israel, why do you assert my way is hidden from the Lord and my claim is ignored by my God?" Why would you ever think that? Why would you ever think that you are hidden from me or that I have forgotten about you? Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the whole earth. He never grows faint or weary. There's no limit to His understanding. He gives strength to the weary and strengthens the powerless. Youths may faint and grow weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who trust in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not faint. The children of Israel were hurting. They were discouraged. They were grieving. And they thought God has forgotten all about us. He doesn't know what we're dealing with, and if He does know, He must not care because nothing is changing. This message thundered from heaven, I don't ever forget about you. Your way's not ever hidden from me. And the message of the passage is God is always working. And Isaiah closed this chapter with 3 metaphors that illustrate the various ways that God works in our lives. And I'd like to cover those over the next couple of hours or so. What? Isaiah finished this 40th chapter with these 3 lines, with these metaphors of the various ways that God works in our lives. First, he said, those who trust in the Lord, they will renew their strength and they will soar on wings like eagles. Sometimes God invades our world with something supernaturally miraculous. Isaiah said, look, God is always working in our lives, and sometimes He works in ways that enables us to soar on wings like eagles. Now, none of us in this room is able to fly. None of us is able to get out from here and say, I don't want to deal with the traffic today, so I'm just going to fly to my home. If we were to fly, we would know that something miraculous had happened. Isaiah said sometimes God works in our lives that way. He intervenes in ways that are miraculous, where our jaws drop and we say, can you believe what God has done? The Bible is filled with all sorts of occasions where God did something miraculous. One of my favorite of those scenes is from the very first book of the Bible. Abraham was 75 years old. At that time, he was named Abram. And God spoke to him, made him a promise, and said, I'm going to give you as many descendants as the stars of the sky and the sand on the seashore. Abraham said, God, I'm 75 years old. I don't even have one descendant. How am I going to have as many descendants as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore? God, that seems impossible. God said, Abraham, I'm making you this promise. You'll have as many descendants as the stars of the sky and the sand on the seashore. A year passed, 5 years passed, a decade passed, 20 years passed, 24 years later, God again appeared to Abraham and said, Abraham, I have not forgotten my promise to you. You are going to have as many descendants as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Abraham said, God, that promise was hard to believe when I was 75, but now I'm 99 years old. I don't even have one child. How can this happen? Sarah was inside the tent preparing a meal. She overheard the conversation between the angel of the Lord and Abraham, and she laughed. She said, that will never happen. And the angel said, Sarah, why did you laugh? She poked her head out of the tent and said, I didn't laugh. And the angel of the Lord said, yes, you did laugh, but I'm telling you, at this time next year, I will return to you and you will have that son. And that's exactly what happened. 100-year-old Abraham, 90-year-old Sarah gave birth to a boy, and they named him Isaac. Now, let me see your hands. How many of you are named after a family member? You're named after a grandmother, a father, something like that, all right? Sometimes moms and dads name their children after family members. Sometimes moms and dads name their children because they like how the first name and the last name sound together. They say the name and they, oh, yes, that's what we want to name our children. But sometimes moms and dads do what people did back in biblical times. They name their children based on the meaning of the name. And so they go through baby books and they start looking. Oh, yes, this means strong warrior. Let's name our son this. This means godly princess. Let's name our daughter that. And they name based on the meaning of the name. I think Gary means slow to learn or something like that. Isaac in Hebrew means laughter. Because Abraham and Sarah knew that every person who heard that they had given birth to a baby would say, who? Abraham and Sarah lived next door to me in the nursing home. They had a baby? That's exactly right. Now, how many of you who are at least 50 years old would like to get a visit from an angel tonight? And have him come to you and say, you need to go buy some diapers. And not for yourself. You are going to have a baby. You would say, God, no, please. We will go to Africa. And God will do anything. Please don't make us go through that again. But that is exactly what happened. Sometimes God works in ways that are utterly miraculous. We can't believe what has happened. And it's not only the Bible that is filled with those occasions, so are our own lives. Before I began traveling and speaking, I served as a student minister in Columbus. One day, a lady who taught 8th grade girls Sunday school for us went to the doctor because she was having pain in her hip. She thought she had pulled a muscle or something like that, and through a series of tests and diagnoses, she learned that she had cancer. And so they immediately made plans for her to have surgery, very drastic, radical surgery, to try to remove this mass that was growing in the side of her body right there close to her hip. For some reason, I was not going to be able to be at the hospital on the day of the surgery. So I went over the evening before, prayed with them in the hospital next to UAB, or in the hotel next to UAB. And the next day I called just to find out how the surgery was going. Her husband, Miss Terry's husband, picked up the phone. And I said, well, just checking on things. How is everything? He said, Gary, we're going home. And I said, well, I didn't even think that she would be through with the surgery, much less out of recovery and ready to go home. He said, they didn't do the surgery. I said, well, did they have a complication? He said, no, Gary, the cancer's gone. He said, the doctor went in and he said, let me just do one little thing before we operate. And when they did, they discovered there's no cancer. When they rolled out of the hospital in the wheelchair and got into the elevator, who did they happen to see but their doctor? And he said, I know you had cancer. When you got here yesterday, you had it. I did not make a mistake. And I don't think your people in Columbus made a mistake. And then he said this sentence, I am not a Christian, but it's times like this that make me want to be. Because that's what God does. Sometimes God comes through, He works in our lives in miraculous ways, and when He works in this means we soar on wings like eagles. It just seems like we could go forever based on the miraculous work that God has done. And sometimes that is what God does, but not always. Isaiah said God works in our lives in another way, and sometimes He does help us soar on wings like eagles. But in other times, on other occasions, God enables us to run and not grow weary. Now, when God chooses to work in this means, we still know God is the one who is doing the working. We still see His hand, but He simply chooses to work through more ordinary means. He works through means that are a little more explainable. God's still doing it, but He just chooses a more ordinary, less spectacular means. The Bible has plenty of occasions where God worked in that way. One of those is when the children of Israel made their way from Egypt over into the Promised Land. After this series of plagues which God delivered upon the Israelites, and Pharaoh said, let my people go, they began a journey traveling through the wilderness, which would eventually take them 40 years to arrive in the Promised Land. But they made it, and they knew that God was leading them. During the day, they would see a pillar of cloud marking out where they were supposed to go. In the evening, God would set up a pillar of fire, and they would travel by it when they were marching. There was no doubt in the minds of the children of Israel that God was the one getting them to the Promised Land, but He was using a more ordinary means to get them there. Couldn't God have done this? Couldn't God have had the children of Israel go to bed in the land of Egypt and then the next morning awaken in the Promised Land? Of course God could have done that. But instead of choosing to work and enabling them to soar on wings like eagles, God said, I will help you run and not grow weary. I'll still be doing the working. You'll still see me moving. But the way that I'm going to work is going to be through a more ordinary means. It's not just the Bible that has those stories, so do our own lives. We have experiences where we know God is working, He's moving, but He's just working in a more ordinary means. When I graduated from Mississippi State, I went straight to New Orleans for seminary. And college times very often are lean financially for people, but seminary especially is. We could not wait for the grocery store papers to come out to advertise boxes of macaroni and cheese on sale 3 for $1. We could go spend $10 and have 30 days of food. And so seminary was an experience when I really had to tighten my belt and watch my money. But during my seminary years, every single month that I was a student, Trinity Baptist Church sent me a check for $50. Every month. Some months the check might arrive on the 9th. Some months it might arrive on the 16th. It could come on the 12th. But every month I would make my way over to the New Orleans, or every day I would make my way over to the post office on the New Orleans campus. I would open up the box and start pulling the mail out. Some of it was junk, a lot of love letters from people in college. They wouldn't leave me alone. And so I just kept pulling the mail out. And every single month, there was a check for $50 that I could use to get through another week or so and buy groceries and stock up. Now, the name at the bottom of the check was Charlene Pruitt. But is there any doubt in my mind that that was God sending that money? None. There was nothing spectacular about that. God could have rained $50 bills out of the sky. God could have enabled me to walk over to the business office one day and say, somebody's paid your entire tuition and room and board and everything, but God didn't do any of that. God chose to work through a different means. I didn't soar on wings like eagles, but I did run and not grow weary. And sometimes that's what God does in our lives. When we are hurting and grieving, when we need relief, when we're asking God, God, why won't you do something? He says, I am doing something. I am enabling you to run and not grow weary. I'm working through more ordinary means, and sometimes that's how God works in our lives. But not always. Isaiah said, there is another way that God chooses to work. Sometimes we soar on wings like eagles. Sometimes we run and not grow weary. But then there are other times when God chooses to work in our lives by enabling us to walk and not faint. And when God chooses to work through this means, God may not do anything at all about our circumstances. He just does something with us. He gives us the perseverance and the strength to keep going when we don't think we can keep going. The Bible is filled with plenty of occasions just like that. My favorite is from 2 Corinthians chapter 12, where Paul said, Corinthians, let me tell you a little bit of my own autobiography. I have this thorn in my flesh. Now, when you and I think of thorns, we think of rose bushes and holly bushes and things like that. And there is a Greek word for that size thorn, but that word is not the one that Paul chose. The word that Paul chose was more like an 8 to 10 inch spike. And he said, every step that I take, this thorn in my flesh just pierces my soul. And it's agonizing. And I really felt like God, like it was limiting me. And so I prayed, God, please remove this thorn in my flesh. You don't understand how painful it is. You don't know how difficult it is. You don't know how hard it is living with this thorn in my flesh. Would you remove it? And Paul said, though I prayed in faith and very sincerely, God said no. Paul said, I prayed a second time. I went back to God and said, God, would you please remove this thorn in my flesh? It's incredibly painful. God, if you would just take away this thorn, I think I could be so much more effective in serving you. God, would you please remove it? And Paul said the second time, God said, no, I will not. Paul said, I went back a third time. And I prayed, God, please. I just don't know if I can keep going. Please remove this thorn in my flesh. And the third time I prayed, Paul said, God gave me a more full answer. He said, Paul, you can stop praying that prayer. I'm not ever going to remove that thorn in your flesh. You'll have to carry it with you as long as you live. But what I will do is I will show you how strong I can be in your weakness. And I will prove to you that my grace is sufficient for you. And when you think that you cannot keep going, you will discover that I will sustain you and help you keep going. I'll help you walk and not faint. But it isn't just the Bible that has those stories. So do our own lives. I suppose that my grandfather on my dad's side of the family was the most cheerful person that I've ever known. When I was a very young boy, my grandfather's left leg was amputated right below the knee. And they gave him a wooden leg that he could walk around on. Now, not like a pirate, a peg leg. I mean, it had a foot and a shoe and sock down at the bottom. And so he had his left leg amputated with a wooden leg down at the bottom. Well, then, not long after that, they had to amputate his right leg down below the knee. So he had two wooden legs to get around on. Eventually, before he passed away, they had to do several more operations. Well, I loved being around him and always enjoyed spending time with him. My grandfather was the type of person that when you were around him, you just wanted to be more around him. When he was no longer able to drive a truck for a living, he still wanted to do something, and so he went out to West Point High School and became the maintenance person. And so when he was out there, he would try to talk with students and make a difference in their lives. My grandmother had a picture hanging on the wall in her house where one of the graduating classes decided they were going to dedicate their senior yearbook to my grandfather, to the maintenance man. Now, who does that? The sign said, to Mr. Sam, he was changing a fluorescent light fixture, said, to Mr. Sam, the light of our lives. Just who he was. He also was the type of person that could turn any conversation into a witnessing opportunity. We might be sitting at a Little League ball game or something like that, and somebody would slide in and say, excuse me, is that seat saved? He would say, the question is not, is this seat saved? The question is, are you saved? Do you know you're going to heaven when you die? It was just that type of person he was. One day, he and I were riding around here in town, and we stopped to go into the hardware store. And as we walked in, the conversation somehow turned to fear. And my grandfather had kind of made his way over to sit down on a chair or a stool, and they were talking about different things that made people afraid. And somehow they began talking about being afraid to die. My grandfather said, I'm not afraid to die. When I die, I'm going to look at Jesus Christ face to face. He said that there are a lot of things, that people may be afraid of. He said, but I'm only afraid of one thing. Well, at that point, I kind of paid attention. I'd never heard him talk about what he was afraid of. And the guy behind the counter said, Mr. Sam, what are you afraid of? He said, termites. Only thing that makes me afraid. Now, couldn't God have one day healed my grandfather's legs so that he would not have had to have them amputated? Of course God could have done that. Couldn't God have enabled some research scientist somewhere to discover a brand new medicine or a brand new procedure that would have opened up those blood vessels and enabled him to keep his legs? Of course. God could have worked in either of those ways, but what he chose to do in my grandfather's life was not work in his legs, but work in his heart. And I think that's God's best work. We all love the stories of the miraculous soaring on wings like eagles. And God sometimes works that way. We enjoy stories where God leads us from Egypt over into the promised land. And sometimes God chooses to work that way. But sometimes what God does is to say to us, I'm not going to change your circumstances. I'm not ever going to make them better. I'm not going to make them different. I'm not going to change your circumstances. I'm going to change you. I'm going to do things in you that you've never even known that I could do. I'm going to empower you. I'm going to strengthen you. You're going to learn more about me, and you're going to be able to walk and not faint. When you think you can't go one more step, you will discover you can put the next foot in front of the other. Why won't God do something? That question is what Heather asked me, and she asked it sincerely. And she's not the first person, and she won't be the last person to ask that question. But the answer that I gave her is the same answer that God gives us. I'm always working. I'm always moving. I'm always doing something. Even when you don't know I am doing something. And I want you to trust me. I want to invite the musicians to come and make their way to the front. They're going to lead us in a closing song of commitment today. Perhaps there are people who are here and you never have received Jesus Christ as your Savior. You won't ever be able to experience the working of God without knowing Jesus. And so if there's someone here, a man, a woman, college student, teenager, boy or girl, and you have not yet received Christ as Savior, in just a moment as we sing together, I'm going to be standing right down here at the front. You just make your way to the front and say, I have some questions about how to begin a relationship with God. Maybe you're hurting. Maybe you're grieving. Maybe you are looking for God to work, and you just want your church family to pray with you and for you, and you would like for them to do that today. Of course you can come, and we'll be glad to do that. In whatever way God's Spirit speaks to you, I hope that you'll be obedient to that. Let's all stand together. We're going to sing together. You come during our commitment time this morning.
Hymn number 433, I